Many of these autoimmune diseases, they're most concentrated in people of color, and particularly women of color.
Dr. Toby Leon Moorsom is extensively researching the intricate relationship between Canada and Jamaica in the booming cannabis industry.
There needs to be a more forceful argument in Jamaica for the very high probability that the cannabis that arrived in Jamaica came from Africa.
If I was selling a person, a human being of a specific skill set, they might get a little bit more preference around stuff. So not everybody who came was in bondages.
Absolutely. It also requires us to think differently about the slave trade and think differently about the Atlantic world before the British gained geographic control over much of the island of Jamaica.
And I am 100% sure that if there is a strain from Jamaica, if we destroy it, it means that we will destroy the thing that made Jamaican ganja valuable. Welcome to today's episode of The Code. Today we're diving deep into the world of Jamaican ganja and a historic approach of Jamaican cannabis with none other than Dr. Toby Leon Moorsom, currently an SSHRC Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Anthropology at the University of New Brunswick in Canada and an adjunct professor at the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University in Canada. Toby is extensively researching the intricate relationship between Canada and Jamaica in the booming cannabis industry. Hailing from Queen's University with a PhD in history, Toby brings a rich tapestry of experiences. His studies have traversed the impact of neoliberal economic policies on emergent farmers in Zambia, and he's explored the wider realm of political economy, environmental history, and Africa's role in global politics. Formerly, Toby was at the helm of the International Relations Department at Lancaster University, Ghana. He's no stranger to multi-country research endeavors, with a lead role in an impactful study on the food system challenges in Ghana. He's worked alongside renowned institutions such as Leeds University and the University of Ghana. As an academic, Toby has lent his voice to numerous publications, from the Canadian Journal of African Studies to Al Jazeera English. But it's not just about academia for him. Toby merges intellectual pursuits with a fervent passion for social justice, be it food justice, global justice, or labor activism. And here's a fun bit. For years, Toby was also the beat behind the decks, DJing with the Kingston-based Soul Shakedown Collective, blending world beats to raise funds for social justice causes. Welcome, Toby. So glad to have you here.
Thanks so much. It's an absolute privilege.
Before we start, did I get that right? Was that intro correct?
Yeah, that's fantastic. I feel honored that you've devoted so much time to including many of my accomplishments from over the years.
Well, I mean, I felt honored that you took the time to kind of study Jamaica and basically look at the area that we might have overlooked ourselves, meaning, ganja, and that, people who've been practicing using ganja as a sacrament for so long have been arrested, have been, hunted down by the police. They've had their fields burned, all this economic destruction. And then now, because it's legal in many of the places that used to say it was a bad thing, everyone's talking about it.
Yeah.
So I want to first ask, why the interest in ganja?
Well, there's a couple of factors, really. The first, it arrives from the fact that I was working in Ghana and I learned about maroon peoples in Jamaica, and the fact that there was even a town, a territory within Jamaica called Akampong, and this is a direct derivative of a Ghanaian name of significance, Achiampong, and different variations of it. So I started paying attention to Jamaica for that reason, but I ended up having a personal health crisis at a sort of approaching middle age. A lot of people end up finding that there's little things wrong, and it just so happened that the illness that I was diagnosed with is one that is one of the first ones in Canada that was considered to be an essential human right, that people within Canada should be able to access cannabinoids to be able to use as treatments. And there's a whole spectrum of diseases called autoimmune diseases that can be very minor and they can be absolutely life-threatening. Of course, diabetes is an autoimmune disease that many people can live with, but they also need essential drugs. Well, there's a number of autoimmune diseases where there's actually huge gaps in treatment options. And you could say, for example, look at non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which might cost somebody a couple of $100s a year. But if those drugs stop working for them, then the next line of defense can cost upwards of $50,000 a year to be able to obtain. And this is especially so with those autoimmune diseases that that seem to benefit from hydroxychloroquine. This is, of course, an anti-malarial drug that during the pandemic actually had a shortage of in Jamaica because Donald Trump and some other people said some really uninformed comments about it potentially being a cure for COVID or a treatment, and it was not the case at all. But so this drug is also one that's very affordable. It's common that people in Jamaica would have access to it, but if usually people tend to have a tolerance to that drug that's about 30 years, and at a point it stops working. And if it stops working, it's like taking insulin away from somebody with diabetes, at least in cases of illnesses like lupus, for example, or Sjogren's syndrome. And if it stops working, your next line of defense are a variety of drugs that are called biologics. And these are experimental still at this point. They're very new. They can absolutely save somebody's life. They can reverse conditions of colitis, for example, that are causing people to be bedridden, hospitalized, and really wasting away. So, but those are exceedingly expensive, and they have this unfortunate side effect of death. They can kill you. They're very dangerous. And so now we have drugs that are maybe a couple of $100s a year, and you have these ones that are extremely expensive. And there's nothing much in between. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that various cannabinoids and particles within, excuse me, the terminology is evading me, but the chemical
CBD
composition.
Yeah.
Yes, but there's also terpenes and rare parts of the particular plant. And of course, each plant has many different variations in the micro microparticles.
Yeah, the microparticles.
Excuse me, I'm not a scientist here. And so you have a large potential gap in treatment options for a wide range of people. And I could go one step further to just say that many of these autoimmune diseases are experienced they're most concentrated in people of color, and particularly women of color. And in fact, diseases like lupus and Sjogren's disease, which is one of the Williams sisters has, she fits within the group that is most susceptible to these diseases. So it targets the poorest people in the world and the people who are lifting the most weight and doing the work that gets most people out the door and into their jobs and leading a productive lifestyle. So you have a huge burden on people who don't have a lot of money, and then you have this potential from a plant which, in fact, has many hundreds of years of history in the ethnobotanical pharmacopoeia that Africans, especially in the southern portion of the continent, had made use of for the last 600 years.
So why that's really incredible to me is that in some of your work, you wrote about basically the analgesic properties of the marijuana or the ganja plant that was being grown in Jamaica that shows some sort of selective breeding, because I think the thought process was, the ganja that is supposedly from the Asian continent has more of the indica strain, and basically the plant that was seen here in some of the earlier drawings and in some of the research that you're showing was more along the lines of sativa and a tree-like. But the THC content is higher, but also so is the CBD, and that specifically speaks to maybe the maroon people valuing that analgesic property, which is, anti-inflammation, anti-inflammatory, the things that you're talking about.
Yes.
And growing it selectively for that. And as many people in Jamaica know, people talk about ganja as a healing property, from simple things as ganja tea to just smoking and feeling better. So that kind of medicinal purpose was already known to the community in Jamaica. So my question to you is that it's very obvious based off what you said, and even to just a community in Jamaica of Rastafari or just anyone in Jamaica, that they know that there are medicinal properties to ganja. And obviously the world is realizing that and waking up to it now. But who is actually going to benefit from this? Is it going to be the people that have been growing this plant for hundreds of years in prosecution, or is it going to be somebody else?
Yeah, well, you touch on a couple of important points there, and I would say the short answer to the last part of the question is that there's been 8 years almost, right? It's almost 8 years since there was a decriminalization. I think it is actually coming up on that, and we have seen, in fact, a processes of dispossession, insofar as the people who had been growing it within Jamaica for at least the last 100 years, and I would make a claim it's much longer, but they have lost in the legalization process because the requirements for licensing are far too strict for the conditions that most smallholders farmers produce in. But the product has declined in price in the North American hemisphere, and there has been a massive scaling up in the coast guards around Jamaica, and the use of satellite imagery and bolstered coast guards with countries like Canada and the US putting millions into supplementing the budgets of the Jamaican Coast Guard, and also providing annual training for interception. So smallholders cannot export even to the surrounding countries, which they had for a long time, of course, under conditions that it was illegal. But I think that the prior point that you talk about is one about its origins. And I think that where I feel there needs to be a more forceful argument in Jamaica is for the very high probability that the cannabis that arrived in Jamaica came from Africa, and it came in the possession of Africans. This is a complicated argument, but right now the CARICOM recognizes a historical narrative that the plant came with East Indian laborers post-emancipation. This is the position that the Jamaican government repeats, and most tourist brochures and things, even from the cannabis companies themselves, support this idea that the plant in Jamaica came from East India with indentured servants. And I think that erases the intellectual contributions of those who came before. And I think it also requires us to think differently about the slave trade, and think differently about the Atlantic world before the British gained geographic control over much of the island of Jamaica. That up until that point in time, there was I am arguing that there was far more mobility of free Africans, or maybe not free, but Africans who are not enslaved.
Yeah.
There's a whole number of ways that they participated in the global, the Atlantic world economy.
I think why it's hard for people to comprehend, because, in the African slave-based diaspora communities, the imagination around slavery is not something that we talk about in a full aspect, as well as the imagery might be that everyone who came was in bondage and chains, which does not, in your papers, reflect the state that a lot of the trade was, especially in the early days, was between, some European traders and maybe some African kings and others. And that means that there might be specific people who came in the trade who might have some more freedom of movement and some time to prepare, because if I was selling a person, a human being of a specific skill set, they might get a little bit more preference around stuff. So not everybody who came was in bondages.
Absolutely.
And now what that means is that you have some people having the ability to have agency to bring some items with them. And that speaks to the idea that you could be bringing seeds. And, if we think about us as only a subhuman thing, which is like, did a person eat the seed and then he, defecates it out, which is not the reality. Because again, you have people freely bringing things. And then separately, I would say, we were at a conference and live, I saw a kind of revelation of another professor speaking that he went to the cornucopia, which is basically a list or a storage of plants in England. So the English cornucopium of Jamaican plants and flora and fauna, and I guess it would be dried out. And it had a ganja plant being listed pre-emancipation around 1810, which speaks to, again, before indentured labor from Asia came, of the ganja plant existing here. And then you have your historical facts of the ganja that exist also looking more like the Southern African type.
Yes.
Which is different than the Asian type. And so I think, for me, if we speak about it in the way that we're prescribing now, like, oh yes, it came from indentured labor, and you talk about the erase of history, we also lose the value of the intellectual property of what the Jamaican slave and Black population did in bringing and holding this plant. Separately, as far as I'm concerned, Jamaica has been, per pound, the largest marketer of ganja during that prohibition time because of the Rastafari, Bob Marley, all those guys. And so now you take away the economic reward from a group that were like beating the horn the whole time and also being criminalized in their own country, criminalized overseas. I just think that's just like crazy.
Well, and I think the majority of Jamaicans do, and there's studies that show that, right? Like, everybody knows that the current system is not assisting the small person and the small grower. And there is this sense that they have, some right to it because it was they suffered for it, right? They also succeeded. Like, you did have many people who accumulated to the point that they were able to support family, build houses. We also we have this idea that is constructed, which the ganja grower is a criminal. And this is a narrative that's constructed in media and among politicians and police forces and all of that. But there's been evidence for decades that shows that the average person who is growing it is a family person that is using the funds to be able to send their kids to school, to be able to support the medical needs of the family, all manner of things that they're doing, which are just the same as anybody else who's a thoughtful person. So we have to put that image of the criminal aside. And I, myself, as a white person from Canada, never once felt that I was in danger among the people who
You visited all four maroon areas in Jamaica, right?
Yes, absolutely. I've traveled to multiple times. So I am doing this research in a Department of Anthropology. And I'm taking the anthropological method seriously. And I think one of the important dimensions of it is that you get greater insights about people over time. If you show up and you just have a quick conversation and you're taking a pad, checking some things, somebody may not tell you the truth the first time, right? Or you only find out some things. Most people tell a narrative that justifies their own current living conditions, right? So if you keep relationships up and you keep returning, you learn more. And you spend intimate time with people. You start to overhear and take part in conversations with kids and youth sitting outside the rum shop or whatever. There's a number of insights that you can develop from that. But in that process, I always felt less than. I would say you can't even say that I didn't feel threatened. In fact, I felt always protected.
Yeah.
Like I really felt that if anybody was going to try and cause me harm, that there would be a pile of people that would step in and stop that, because the vast majority of Jamaican people, as far as they are related to the cannabis plant, are really good people.
And I think that sucks because, those people have criminal records in some instances, which excludes them from the formal system.
Yeah, that's one of them.
And similarly, African Americans who also have that as well, who've been, criminalized for that behavior. And I will remember, just because I went to school in the US with mostly white people, I think there was less than 10% people of color at my school, which is fine. It was a great school. But you could sense that the police there had a different relationship with the plant, with the students, because they were not trying to send the kids to jail. They would just be like, oh, stop doing that and, take it away, but no actual reporting. So they had a separate campus police outside. So that was a system that basically says, well, our kids might experiment with this drug at the time, on campus, but let's not put them in jail because they can still be presidents, they can still be anything. But then if you're doing it outside of that community as a black person in a black space, you're going to jail. And that's the end of your life, most likely.
The health minister in 1973, a fellow named by the last name of McNeil, he pointed out this practice in 1973, discussing the fact that kids of the bourgeoisie have now sort of started to experiment with this, but that's not the same as what's happening off in the hills, right? And those are those who are producing it up in the hills, and those who are black working class users are being criminalized for it. And I mean, I think you take people like Ras Ayavi, for example, a very outspoken cannabis activist and labor activist. You have to recognize that Ayavi was a labor activist even before he was a Rastafarian. And there's a significant overlap between the Rastafarian origins and labor history, and that they were rebel rousers. But Ayavi, in a conversation to me about his life story, it was very clear. He said, this is a working class drug. Rich people tend to like cocaine and things like that. But because this is a working class drug, that gets targeted. And it's specifically, and I think that this is an important dimension about the cannabis laws in Jamaica.
Yeah, I was going to ask, in 1941 and 1961, there were two periods where this is pre-independence, where we increased the punishments, against those who were seen or have cannabis grow, use. And I have a couple of questions at the time, what was going on in the world because World War II, 1941, and 1961, that's, self-determination. This is the year before independence. And there's this link with the fear of this increasingly militant lower class, which I know the Rasta represents the ultimate rebel rouser, who is just like, even, clearly anti the establishment.
Yeah.
What is that link in your opinion?
It has to be understood, first of all, in the context of the first 100 years of supposed emancipation in Jamaica. That over the course of that 100 years, the minimum wage for a cane cutter did not move $1, 1 cent. Like it was 100 years. And there's a couple of reasons why that was the case. The first is that instead of laborers fighting the plantation owners for better working conditions, they sought exit. They wanted to get land and grow their own food. And this also comes back to an issue of the lowering caloric intake post-emancipation of plantation workers, because prior to emancipation, it was the responsibility of the slave owner to provide provision grounds in which the slaves could grow mostly ground provisions, which would be tubers, things like yam, sweet potato, taro, or what you guys call dasheen, these kinds of plants, which actually happen to be African in origin, not all and exclusively, because of course you had taro in South America. But many of those ground provisions that slaves kept were African crops. But then at emancipation, with a wage, there was no obligation among the slave owners to keep the provision grounds rights. So you saw declining living conditions, declining health of the population of people who remained in plantation labor. So that it enhanced the need to exit. And so Jamaicans sought to establish small homesteads. They became peasants. We call it peasantization of Jamaica.
So instead of being a laborer, working for somebody else, taking this, slave wages,
Yeah.
We go off where? Where do we go?
Into the hills, but there's a variety of ways in which people gain access to land, and a good number buy them, but a huge number are squatting on lands that are considered crown lands, and the importance of gaining their own plot is that it allows people to have that exit from late, but it's also the goal of those farmers is to grow as much as they can, so they have to work the least amount off farm labor. But you can go and do a bit of like piecework, day labor, and own your own plot that ensures your food, your sustenance of your family. And then you can engage in the labor market under terms that are a slight bit more equitable and better. You don't have the same pressure, right?
So basically, if we just go back, I guess, 170 years or whenever, 200 years, and I say, I have my own land, I can grow, I'm not going to die because I can eat my own food that I grow and my family can survive. Yeah. I have more negotiation power at the table with anybody.
Yes.
Because I'll be like, no, I want X amount more, because if I don't accept it, I'm not going to die.
Yes. And so one way of looking at Jamaican history is that you can see it as a process, as a long battle to try and capture that labor. And so you see the active underdevelopment of smallholder production because the interests of the largest capitalist owners in Jamaica, mostly foreigners, were to have the cheapest labor possible. So if you help small farmers succeed, you're reducing their potential profits.
I see that. So basically, if you give people options that they can survive and have a decent life without joining your labor system, and your labor system's only value is that it's cheap labor, basically they won't join the system, and then...
Yes, and I think that this is the logic that drives this current government in Jamaica, honestly. I think you have the PNP offering a little bit of a kinder narrative, more social democratic kind of position. But I think in policy terms, there's actually very little difference between what they're proposing and what the current JLP government is proposing. So, yeah, so it's about capture, labor capture, and the differences between paying you $6 a day as a cane cutter and $5 a day as a cane cutter is the profits that go to Tate and Lyle and the other multinational corporations. I mean, in the present day, you have Appleton Estate, like that is owned by an Italian company. They import, percentages of sugar from other countries while Jamaican fields lie empty. These are tendencies that go back many, many decades, and it's not changed. So you have to think about what is the logic? And I would say you can go a long way in trying to understand it by thinking about it as an attempt to capture the cheapest labor possible and make sure there's enough really poor people in Jamaica.
So they can just fill in whatever mass labor.
Yeah, replaceable.
And
the Rastafarians, and so we come back to 1938. 100 years after emancipation, there'd be no progress for the wages of cane cutters, and you had basically a general strike, but it built up in waves of like strikes in every sector of the Jamaican economy that were crippling productivity on the island. It was an extreme show of force, and we also, of course, had the formation of the labor movement with Bustamante and Norman Manley. This is where their origins are as well, and it, of course, in this process, I point out, as many do, that the Rastafarian were involved in these struggles, and they're intimately linked with the rise of Black radical thought. The United Negro Improvement Association, Marcus Garvey. This is intellectually a fascinating time, and it's a time where Jamaicans stood up and wanted more.
A couple of things I don't want to touch on too long, but they say things like Jamaica has a lot of growthless jobs. Meaning that there are more jobs, more people are employed, but they're in sectors where they're at the bottom of the labor pool, and that could be in the call center, that could be in tourism, in that place, which there certainly are seen as replaceable. And then I assume that maybe the same logic holds true, that if somebody could go and farm and do well doing that, then they wouldn't want to work in tourism.
Well, exactly. And so this is what the component that we have to add in, of course, then is cannabis. And the role that it played was as a supplemental cash crop. And I mean, I'm using language from the studies that were done in the 1970s by Rubin and Comitas, Vera Rubin and Lambros Comitas, that was conducted in close association with the Michael Manley government, and they found, as the colonial officers did in the 1930s, that most of the ganja was being produced on small family plots intermingled among food crops. And that is, from the law enforcement perspective, the police think this is a way to disguise it. There was also a lot of community collaboration in trying to plant on other people's land to disassociate yourself from the plot. So it took a lot of community engagement. So I think it's one of many reasons why we can talk about it as a collective good, that it was something that Jamaican peasants were not even as individuals responsible for, but as a group. And it allowed you to have your food crops, but also have some income that could come in gradually over a period of time because it didn't spoil right away, right? You could pick ganja and sell it after it's dried at any point in a number of months ahead. I mean, I still find old Rastas who really like stuff that's aged a full year, which of course depletes it of most of its molecular medicinal content, but it's more like tobacco in that sense, in that it ages and becomes a smoother smoke. So that's what some of the elders appreciate in the plant. But so that the point is only to say that you can extend the life of it beyond what nowadays your shelf life is really 6 months, and it deteriorates.
So who were these people selling the ganja to in like 1930s, 1940s? Like, who would be the customer on the other end of that?
The customers were predominantly workers, and this is where the patterns of ganja use in Jamaica are consistent with the use over a 500-year period in the southern portion of the African continent, and cannabis, it first, came through Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa into Central Africa and dispersed around the south of Africa, southern part of the continent. And it did so following heavy labor, roots of heavy labor. A very good book on this is Chris Duval's African Origins of Marijuana. It's exceptionally good historical geography treatment of its history, but in it he argues that Africans actually invented the smoking of it. It had been used prior, like for thousands of years in China and India, in other medicinal purposes, but never smoked. And the advantage to smoking it is that you get rapid dosage, whereas if you take some oils of it or chew some in the morning and swallow it, you maybe you'll start to feel the effects many hours later, but you can dose it quickly and get the effect. And so this coincided with heavy labor, and in fact there are documented cases in Portuguese colonies in what is now Mozambique and Angola, where the cannabis was like ganja was given. It wasn't ganja there at that time. It was mostly known as jambo, various versions of that. It was given as rations to workers on plantations. And it was what we would describe today as a sativa, although taxonomically it's inaccurate. But it's a stimulant. It is not like a sit on the couch and chill kind of product. At that time, it is like a coffee with a bit of ibuprofen, and maybe helps people. There's a long association with meditation.
Helps with pain, gets you moving, allows you to move a lot of goods or blocks or heavy things.
And I think the labor thing, there's an element. Well, the Rastafarian use it for meditation, and people who are even today using cannabis, working people, they'll say it helps them like deal with the monotony of work. But I think there's a way that a part of it's like, I want to keep this little portion of my brain to myself. I'm not handing this over to the person who's buying my wages. I want to be able to think and meditate and philosophize myself, right? So it's like a way to intellectually detach to some degree and have a little sphere of your own space, your own person. I something like that.
No, I'm seeing, to understand it, because I know people with low wages, at least in the working community of Jamaica, have a high attachment or usage of ganja. And it was making sense to me, even because I would say my mom comes from a Catholic family and is very conservative, and she would tell me, if you smoke ganja, you're going to die. That's her understanding of it. And, people talk about it being a thing that takes away motivation as well, as in it makes you happy with nothing. That's what some people say. And in a weird sense, I was hearing this narrative as you were speaking, that in this idea of the capture label, that if you give somebody a farm and they can grow their own food, and then you give them ganja and they can, detach from the world intellectually and also feel happy with less, then their incentive to participate in the labor market, the slave wage labor market, is very low, because he'd be like, why am I going to run down something that doesn't even want me there, that's paying me so little, when I can grow my own crops and smoke my marijuana or ganja and feel happy?
Yeah.
And I see how that itself would be something that you'd want to criminalize, because then it really makes it hard for that same group to participate.
Yeah. But it should also say that this is where there's an important dimension of it. When I say it's like an ibuprofen, and it was this is, of course, varies depending on strains and your profiles of the plant, the particular strain. But where its application is really interesting in medicine is that there seems to be an ability to reduce inflammation and relax connective tissue. This is also something when you're using your muscles for like many hours of a full work day, you're doing really hard labor. It has a medicinal effect on that. And so workers, it was not about amotivating, it was motivating. And in fact, there were really bad studies that were done early on in the post-independence era that looked at the uses of the labor productivity of plantation workers who smoked and those who did not. And the only difference that they saw is that they thought that the people who had smoked it made some movements that were not as efficient. So they might have exerted a few more calories than the person who didn't smoke it. But this study was really bad, and it was not considered credible for many scientific
research standards. Yeah, I see that.
Yeah. So it's not. But carry on. It looks like you have another question.
Well, I mean, I just think it's so interesting that's where the thing was going. But there's this question that comes up, because I see that we were selling it to other workers and it was growing in these hills. I kind of want to talk about the characteristics of the ganja plant that was grown in the hills, because I'm realizing from your research that these locations were not the best place to grow this plant, meaning the soil itself, or the quality, the temperature, the moisture. And so the ganja had to take on a different characteristic, and also speaks to expert growers. Could you talk a little bit about that? Yeah.
But first, I might just flag, before going in deeply, is that from the 1970s, it's really important. A lot of the police reports show that the people who were the biggest growers were often those who were associated with more conservative churches. And because they had more capital to be able to wield, and they were the least suspected. So many people would be, hypocrites in the minds of Rastafarian peoples often. But yes, so I'm in making this argument that the plant derives from the southern part of Africa. I'm also suggesting that it lay as a sort of a repository of the genetic content, lay within the territories controlled by Maroon peoples, and I think that this depends on a couple of insights. One is that I made the point earlier that many of the earliest slaves that were brought here were actually, professionals. They had, qualifications that were often scientific. They might be doctors, but they were often engineers, people that understood irrigation, for example. So the Portuguese and the Spanish, who were here, of course, the Spanish, but they targeted, people who had these skills. And these have been shown in a number of studies.
So basically, the slaves and the labor that they took from Africa were not just random people.
No.
They were skilled.
And many were absolutely exceptional military strategists. And they were powerful people, very intelligent and skilled, and often taken from the elite strata of the Southern African societies that they came from. So you can't underestimate the intellectual ability of those people. And I am making this point that with them there is a ethnobotanical package of plant species and biota that they transported, and this is a contrary narrative to the way history of the world post 1500 is told. You have a very common perception that's created by historian Alfred Crosby, who wrote The Columbian Exchange, and he also wrote an influential book called Biological Imperialism. I think it's that, or some imperialism. Anyway, he makes an argument that white settler societies, that colonial societies that were imperialist, that they sent people around the world to recreate societies somewhat in their own image, that they went with a backpack of technologies, of plant species that they utilized. Well, I'm pointing out, along with some others, but that Africans had their own backpack, or portmanteau is the word he used. It just means a suitcase. We have to look at the ingenuity and the brilliance of your African forefathers that also transferred many of those species here. And we'd have to take something like cannabis and say it's a technology, right? Especially if you know how to smoke it and obtain the medicinal properties of it in a very rapid dosage. But of course, it was used. Most maroon peoples would be using it as teas and in medicines that they soak in rum and things like that. So it had uses, and I'm postulating that it's possible that even as far Nanny might have had cannabis with her, right? And so there's another important component of it that was first really brought to my attention more specifically was by the Colonel Latibaudière from Scots Hall Maroons, who pointed out that if those Maroons, the earliest Maroons, had cannabis with them, it also would have been in the hands of women, because they were responsible for medicine and taking care of the wounded, taking care of the children and the elderly, while men were participating in the battles. So this is not just an African technology, but it's one that is particularly close to African women's labor. So if you're not recognizing it in the processes of creating an industry out of it, if you're not recognizing this original claim to its the ingenuity and the innovation that took place, then you're doing it's a historical injustice. But I'd make one last point also about the strain, which you alluded to, thankfully, because you've read my article very well. But the strain that came here does not appear to be consistent with those that would have been in East India in the 1800s. That the strain has all the characteristics of those that came from Southern Africa. It's called a narrow leaf variety. And those same plants were then taken up to West Africa. So they could have also come with the slaves that were brought from Ghana. It's possible there. But of course, I'm saying that there's a whole number of other routes that Africans were involved in the Atlantic world economy. And I use this point, and I think it's important to mention as well, is that 1 out of 10 slave ships mutinied. A certain number of those that mutinied were successful. So who are you if you are a boat filled with Africans who are now in control of a ship? Well, you're outlaws or you're pirates. But they also joined Maroon communities. And the Maroons were far more mobile than we understand. So it's possible that Jamaican Maroons traveled to Brazil, got some cannabis there. It's possible that they traveled to surrounding islands. And this is especially important when you think of the fact that the Maroon peoples intermarried with Taino. There's a lot of people within Jamaica that deny claims to indigeneity of the Maroon peoples, but there's genetic studies that show people in Akampong have 20% of their genetic composition is Native North American. There was overlap. There was an integration. They learned about the particular American plant species from the Taino, but the Taino were seafaring peoples. They had boats. They traveled widely. They had relatives dispersed through different islands. So there's many avenues by which Africans could have brought it here. And I should also mention that in West Africa, there were some wealthy Africans who commissioned their own trading ships and took part in the Atlantic world economy. These are all like histories that are hard to rebuild because they don't sit in the colonial archives. There's no records of them.
Yeah, I know what sucks is that, I don't think our people have been the best at maybe keeping a written record compared to an oral record. And separately, I think it's very hard to do that when, if you have, let's say, I call it 3 European languages, four European languages that have really propagated in the west of, let's call it the global south, that they captured English, Spanish, French, and maybe Portuguese for Brazil and some of those other places. At least if you're writing in that language, it's easy for it to be tracked. But I can't imagine that if I'm writing or storing in a different language before Google Translate, before all this stuff, and without maybe the intellectual powers or the research institution spending money or time to direct and say, go out and find this archive, translate it, bring it into our books, it'd be hard to kind of get that. And, DNA speaks to some of those things that maybe the people in Akopong knew the story of. So they would be saying, no, yes, my great-great-grandmother was a Taino, and this is what was happening. And people are saying, oh, that can't be true. You don't look that way. And then a DNA test says 20% North American. North American must mean from this region of that roaming people, and speaks to all the history that we do know about the native Indians who were here. And so that proves what they're saying. And I think what's funny is that a lot of the things that you're saying, if people decide to look into it, it can be proved with modern science.
Yeah, so I am trying to work with Michel Emmanuel, professor lecturer at the University of the West Indies in biosciences, and he's a brilliant scientist that understands all the genetic and chemical profiles of cannabis more broadly, but we're hoping that we can get together a study that tries to map out the genetic heritage of the cannabis seeds strains, the original strains in Jamaica. But this is a very difficult thing, and this is why in this article that would be forthcoming, I use the term extinction because we are really at a moment where the original strains are very close to extinction, and so based on this fact, I also think that just on this fact alone, I would have to advocate a policy approach towards cannabis in Jamaica is that you do not eradicate. You leave it there until we can know what's here. The thing.
So no more burning ganja.
No more burning ganja, and most importantly, if people find the old, you'll know it because it's very tall. Often the one that people make the gum with. These are strains that have been acclimatized and bred to succeed in the very difficult growing conditions in Jamaica. Its humidity levels are very high, but the problem is that since the 1970s, you've had a gradual importation of hybrid strains that come ripe in a much shorter growing season. The problem with the old cannabis is that it took 6 to 9 months to mature, and by the time it's ready to harvest, it's October, and the police can come in and eradicate and burn all at the same time, and then the farmers lost their crop for the entire year. What the imported strains did is they allowed farmers to evade the annual crop destruction processes. They get away from the helicopters. Even if they took one of your crops, you could get 3 in within a year if they all mature in 4 months. Especially now, people are using a lot of cloning, which speeds up the cycle, and so you have a ganja complex, a production system that is common in places like Orange Hill, where they've got 3 cycles a year, and they have laborers. And laborers, I asked many of the larger farmers, and I say larger, and we're talking about like 1.5 acres of field, but I asked them, would you ever grow some of the old time stuff? And they just say they can't because they have people to pay. They offer jobs. But the thing is those old time strains have very unique genetic profiles that, one, we don't have any open source records of. And you have a process here that we call bioprospecting, that you have companies, especially from Canada, that have come into Jamaica and they've tried to capture the older strains. And as I mentioned earlier, that it seems that if the cannabis here that came from Southern Africa, it's remarkable because it does have a THC content that is much higher than the average THC content of its ancestors on the southern continent, but it also has a very high CBD content, which is the case with some of those strains in the Congo as well. And you'll see there's on the internet, you can go out and see strain hunters, and
I saw a video of them coming down to...
Yeah, you find these Dutch guys that are like, have lots of money to get on planes and go on like a 3-week tour up the river to get to a remote place. And in that particular video, while they're taking seeds, some of the locals start to hear that they're like going to take it back and make a medicine out of it, and they get really mad, right? They have to exit quickly, but that's because it's theft.
Yeah,
they know, and it's theft of their intellectual property. So there are Canadian companies that are doing that, and the Jamaican government is helping them, and nobody's trying to look out for the preservation of there are a few elder Rasta that are conservation minded, and they see the extinction taking place, and they're trying to preserve it. But of course, they'll get cross-pollinated.
So one of the things that I want to kind of argue for now is basically looking at the economic value of this, let's call it localized, untouched strain, which is rare. I believe personally that as weed becomes decriminalized and legal in many countries, eventually the way the world is going in a more liberal sense, you probably will be able to export or take value of the things that you have. And I am 100% sure that if there is a strain from Jamaica, the country that is most famous for ganja, that is completely indigenous here, and you can market that story of it basically coming directly from Africa and changing to have medicinal values, to have higher THC content, that is something that people will probably at that time pay a premium for.
Exactly.
And if we destroy it because of wrong economic incentives, because basically the police are going to burn your ganja, are going to do this, so you have to get a crop that grows fast. So the natural crop that's here, when you have satellite imagery and all these other things to track, you don't want to grow that. And that makes the people who've been basically, in my opinion, carrying this plant for all this time when it was illegal, have no interest economically to carry it, unless you said they are interested in conservation. It means that we will destroy the thing that made Jamaican ganja valuable in a short-term run to please some capitalist that isn't even here.
Yes.
Or values.
I believe that that's what is at risk here. And so I think that, this is why I'm working on this book on intellectual property with colleagues at the University of West Indies that have spearheaded this, and Yentl Williams being one among them. That now they're interested in trying to assist Jamaica and Jamaicans in getting some access to this, but I think we have to see it as a public good. That and so how it is utilized is a matter that's of interest to everybody in Jamaica. But I think that in 10 years, you are going to have an international market that it will trade more like tobacco. And it's possible, if there was the political will, to have day auctions in the same way you do with tobacco. And one of my arguments is that in general, the cannabis plant is going to be an awful lot more like cocoa, tobacco, maybe a bit like grapes. It's a high value commodity that requires specific post-harvest treatment. And if you look at those other commodities, what you see over the last 50 years is an increasing decline in the percentage of the profit at sale that goes to the farmer. Like, to the point that in coffee, for example, African farmers have lost 300%. Like the resale of African beans from Europe has increased 300% compared to relative to what the farmer is obtaining. So you have a global economy that is increasingly impoverishing rural peoples and creating pressures of migration to cities, to other countries of the world, as their livelihoods are attacked. And so on that basis, I think that I would also say that that's been justified in the cannabis sector. The idea that there can be no room for smallholders in the cannabis sector has been justified on under this perception that it needs to be hermetically sealed and controlled and blocked off from other plants within nature. And what we know is that, cannabis, it does not need to be grown in a greenhouse to produce effective medication. And in fact, you're going to get a stronger plant if it is grown in outdoor conditions. Some big companies understand that here.
So basically, it sounds like to me there are a bunch of people who are making rules for a system that they didn't participate in for 100-something years. The rules benefit a certain group of people more who have capital to kind of follow the rules, meaning, okay, you need to have this big building that is separate from everything, a greenhouse, this very expensive production to say that it's medically sound, which the small holding farmer never had the amount of profit to ever do that. But somebody else who was saying, lock them up, now can basically get capital from another system and then invest and, basically make these kind of stringent requirements.
Yeah, and the people that are aligned with them are the ones that, just about every farmer I talk to say the ones trying to make money on it now are the ones that used to call for us to be locked up. Now, I make a point here of saying trying to make money because most of them are not, right? I mean, there's a few, I would say, one Canadian, I think, who was being perhaps the most responsible form of investment is in Itopia. Blaine Dowdle, for example, he's just one investor in a company that has Jamaican ownership, and I think that it's a relationship that seems to be much more sensitive to the importance of Jamaican economy, but I don't think that's the case with the others.
I know the CLA has put a lot of stringent requirements on dispensaries and, of course, growing and how you transport ganja and administrative things around it, which is just so anti the nature of how ganja was moving before and the small holding farmer. And the idea that I just move ganja in a bag on a bike, and now you're saying I must write to somebody, call to them, send emails, get that approved, carry it in a certain type of vehicle. That is burdensome on the actual skill of the entrepreneur who was just moving it on a bike, and almost to me impossible for him to access.
Yes. So there's another component of this that I really want to mention is that when you talk about growing without like fences, for example, and security cameras and all of this, when you talk to even small growers, and I'm just trying to say, can you imagine a future where it's grown all over the place? And the concern is that it's theft, right? Because it's high value and people will come in and steal. And when people mention that to me, I say, can you imagine all the millions of dollars that gets put into eradication programs and policing and harassing the producers? Can you imagine if those police were actually asked to help you protect it? Use the public resources to not fight against the economic amelioration of the small farmer, but actually support them. And I think that there are many examples that occurred, and especially in my research in Africa, post-independence, there were strategies that were applied to try and improve the production of small farmers and in general improve the economic performance and the living conditions that they sat in, and they were succeeding. And I think that there's what Jamaicans don't recognize is that their own intellectuals, the Caribbean intellectuals, were arguing for very different models of smallholder inclusion in global commodity markets. And specifically, I advanced the idea of a marketing board. There's other forms of alternative trade.
Is that from Arthur Lewis or is that Walter Rodney?
That is from Arthur Lewis, who is lauded at the University of the West Indies as the first Black vice chancellor, has an Institute of Economics and political economy at the university, and yet at independence, well, really from the 1940s, he was arguing that if you want to, you have to start from recognizing that it's a context of underdevelopment, that the colonial process destroyed, damaged, distorted societies in the global South, threw a bunch of people together in the Jamaican rock and tried to control every movement of people. You have to start from a position of breaking out, a strategy to break away from a plantation economy, which is dependent upon keeping the wages down. And the only way he felt you could do it was through a marketing board. Now that is to take all the commodities, and there's been schemes with bananas and things like that, where
Colombia is one of them.
European former colonial countries would pay a higher price for the bananas for a certain number of time because, and the reason why is because there's arguments for reparations, and these reparations arguments are not at all being attached to cannabis, and I think they actually really apply they're even more important in the case of cannabis. But I think it also points to the fact that these reparations need to come as much from the United States as it does from England. But Arthur Lewis was saying you could have a marketing board that's job is to buy produce from farmers. When it comes down to it, in practical terms, it's a vehicle. Driving around, dropping off inputs, driving around, picking up the products for market. And then they have a capacity now collectively to be able to bargain on the international market and obtain the best price possible in global commodity markets. And there's challenges with marketing boards. They don't all succeed, but they still are in existence in many commodities. We have them in Ghana, the cocoa marketing board, which Arthur Lewis, in fact, was an essential component in the establishment of that marketing board. And it's got problems. It's highly politicized, and they're prone to graft. So it means that people are tempted to steal from it. That those who are in power, and especially when it comes, associated with political parties.
I think Pan-Africanism and this idea has maybe died out a little bit in terms of my view of the average Caribbean person who has a position of power or who is doing anything. I don't think they're thinking about, the other African countries as much as it seems when that time was around, when people were reading and really participating, even though technically technology was worse, technically travel was more expensive in a sense, but it seems to me that back then there was really this sense of let's move our intellectuals around, like Walter Rodney and those guys, and that idea of that kind of organization.
Well, and they were collaborating too, right? There was a federation that it was attempted before independence. There was this effort for Caribbean islands to bind together and federate, so they had more clout in global political economy. No, they didn't, and in many ways, we'd have to situate Jamaica and the policies around cannabis also in the context of a counter-revolution, right? Because in the Manly years, when even mild social democratic reforms were being proposed, they were like the business elite here was terrified that they were going to become like Cuba, right? So it then situates Jamaica as a central figure, a central country within the U.S. War against communism, the war against socialism, and so it becomes a pivot, right? It's Jamaican troops that take out Bishop in Grenada, right? And so Jamaica becomes a bit of a henchman, and even to this day, if you look at the uses of Jamaica in relation to Haiti, for example, it plays a very important role in furthering the agenda of Western powers, but particularly the United States. And so Jamaica, it doesn't have independence in global geopolitics.
People like Walter Rodney and the underdevelopment of Africa, this idea of exploiting other people and moving to, a human being exploiting another man, a man becoming a community and exploiting another community, and a community eventually becoming a nation and exploiting another nation. And in this exploitative behavior, you can move certain parts of labor to another space or place that you can do the worst things that allow you to take their economic surplus and move it to your economy, while you move your people up and basically fast forward your economy into the kind of modern world industrialization where a lot of the things that you need to do to kind of survive, you don't need them anymore. Microwaves, robot cleaners, whatever. But you are always making sure that the worst parts of labor are either being done by a migrant population or in other countries. And that's being seen because even countries that are being exploited are also part of a chain that's exploiting other regions or spaces. And, you know, when you study that book, the understanding of reparations becomes much more clear because it's more obvious to me that economic activity that arises from slavery is not just a one-off piece of money, it's a multiplier effect that means that almost everyone in that nation has benefited from, because it's not just like, oh, well, you know, 200 years later, well, I had nothing to do with that. My family was never slave owners. The reality is that the institution of the state that might have educated, the institution of the state that built the infrastructure that is the road, benefited in some point or form from a multiplier effect by the money that was taken away by the surplus of these other places. And so that makes a very strong state for reparation. So the idea that I have is I would love to see a Michelin type magazine being created for the Rastafarian tribes and the people of the Maroons who basically this whole time held the plant to be true and used it as a religious sacrament to, in the form of reparations, pay for these people to come together and give them a salary to fly around the world to all these countries and white spaces to grade marijuana and to write about it and do videos on it to tell people about basically the quality of the smoke and so on and so forth. And I find that that would be a legitimate case because I don't believe that if somebody of any color, of any race, looked at somebody who was from that space and Rastafarian to say, this guy has decided that he's an authority on ganja and the quality of it, that seems like a natural thing that people would accept and actually even value. And I think that's an easy way to give people, a group of people that have been trapped on this land, exposure to other spaces. Secondly, I love the idea of a trade board. I think that's a fantastic thing. And I think there should be also reparations to kind of fund that. And I would also say, finally, that some of the places and spaces that are using Jamaican symbolism, Jamaican names in their ganja should also pay into educating specifically the Maroon spaces on entrepreneurship, because the idea that in this new legal world, the requirements are so stringent and so heavy in administration means that somebody who's a small holding farmer can't participate and gain any economic value in that system because the requirements are too much. And if you're saying that's the only way to survive, the people who are now getting rich off of this should probably put some capital back into training these people to then participate.
Yeah.
And so that was my idea.
And I think that there's, you know, the concept of underdevelopment that Walter Rodney utilizes, it applies in just the sector of cannabis within Jamaica. Like, you don't take a person, throw them in jail, separate them from their kid, and inflict a whole pile of emotional pain on a group of people and expect them to come out and be like in good shape, right? It harms people. It was, and I think this was a strategy ultimately, or at least it is the effect, is that you have that multiplied over and over. The places where a lot of the the Rastas live are not without social problems, and we have to start by acknowledging that. So and I think that this is where again Arthur Lewis was talking about this. He's saying you have to start from addressing the variety of problems that exist, and the marketing board is only one component. And the marketing board, in his imagination, was to be funded by the British and the US. Now, look at a country like Britain today, and most of the wealth in that country has been sent through Hong Kong to investments in Asia. It's not even sitting on the rock in anymore. So how one goes about obtaining reparations payments is a complicated matter. But even in his imagination, it was one thing. But what was essential to coincide with that was investments in education, investments in other social provisions. I mean, in all the places where smallholders are growing in this country, people face the same problems: insufficient insufficient education, both in proximity and the quality of education. That's people don't even have playgrounds for their children to play on at these rural schools, right? They don't have water and sanitation. And this is an issue I bring attention to because that fact alone is undermining the tourism economy that this government does, and Jamaican governments have for years put a lot of attention towards. But in a place like Westmoreland, for example, there have been scientific reports arguing for years that there needs to be investment in sanitation, sewage sanitation plants, because the 50% of the people, even more than that, don't have even a flushing toilet, right? They have pit latrines. And those who do have flushing toilets have septic beds. But these septic beds are too close to the water. They're too close to water runoff, and they end up in the rivers, and they go out and they kill the grasses, which hold the beaches in, and they help contribute to the destruction of the coral reefs. So those people that are growing the ganja, for everybody's sake, need basic piped-in water and sanitation, as you would expect in any modern country of the world. This is
so the economic activity and the living of these people, has a consequence in the future of damaging the things that we make the most money off of now, meaning the tourism.
Exactly.
If the beach is not retained, if there is no coral reefs, that just makes it a less attractive location.
Yeah, and I mean, at the same time, you can also say, if you had an eye towards tourism in the future, beaches are going to be less important because people are really interested in health and being, active. Where could they hike here? Well, it's mostly maroon territory, and there's been no thought towards making use of trails throughout them. I mean, that's what, if you go to Dominica, they have the maroon trails all the way up the island. You can walk as if you're in Italy or France. You can...
Small island Dominica?
Yeah, you can walk from one town to another and have a stay at a guest house, get your food, and then get back on the trail, and it'll have nice services around nice waterfalls and things like that. I mean, these are possibilities that could be explored here alongside a cannabis industry in which smallholders were flourishing. But you can't assume it will take place without addressing all the wide variety of problems facing these communities, and it comes down to social provision.
Is there a list of all the problems that exist in these communities, or at least the government attempt or some academics attempt to kind of write up
the basic Jamaica statistics?
The Statistics
yes,
Institute of Jamaica.
Yes, I mean they give an awful lot of insight into the context, and we all know, of course, there's some attention, but not sufficiently enough paid to the issues of gender violence, right? This is these are deadly, right? They're horrid circumstances, but it's in a context where people have multi-generational trauma that has never been healed, and these are not my words. This is what I hear everywhere I'm going, and I so many times people tell me that Jamaica's high rates of ganja use are because people are self-medicating for the trauma that was never addressed. And I mean, I think there's an element to it. But I would say also on the rural front here, you have addictions. And these are addictions that are like the biggest players in society are taking part in, namely the sugar industry, right? It's pushing content within sugar drinks to school children, not adhering to the laws that were put in place. I mean, these are reports, and the Gleaner has done some good work on that. But you have sugar addictions, you have gambling machines in almost every single little rum shop. Some of the youth are lacing their cannabis joints with liquid nicotine. I'm seeing, and then of course there's a inordinate consumption of rum, which is another sugar product. So I think that
there's a lot of negativity in that, and those things have negative externalities on the communities. Because a gambler doesn't just affect himself; it's something that affects the family that he's in, and affects the outlook.
It's predatory, right? It's predatory economy.
But there was a study, I think, and I know there's anecdotal evidence on basically these types of drugs and their incidence of like violent crime. And there is a incident in Jamaica where people are more likely to commit certain violent crimes when they are smoking ganja, and of course alcohol and those things like that. But doesn't mean there's tons of people that smoke ganja and never committed a crime. But it's just that there are a group of people who, when they have done it, they were taking cannabis. And I don't know if anecdotally people will speak to say it affects people differently or blah, blah. What do you respond to something like that?
Well, I think first of all, we have to really recognize that it is true that the ganja, the cannabis that is available in Jamaica is very different than your grandfather's cannabis, and the CLA and data that has been produced shows that the THC content has risen dramatically since legalization. The same thing has occurred in Canada as well. So while I propose a permissive attitude, a permissive policy framework towards smallholders, it doesn't mean that I think that there does not need to be interventions to ensure that efforts are taken to address unhealthy consumption. And having cannabis available medicinally is extremely important, and people have a right to be able to recreationally consume it. But again, it's one of these instances where you have to have policy interventions at the school level. You have to have, no matter how many barriers you put on somebody from accessing any of these drugs we're talking about here, and I'm including sugar in that, it is going to be people are going to get around it, right? You can't try and put laws in place that will have much effect in keeping it out of the hands of youth, for example. As all my research in the medical side of cannabis, it makes me think that it's actually particularly worrisome that adolescent people more broadly, but especially adolescent men, boys in Jamaica are consuming very large quantities of it because their brain development has not completed.
And that was something I wanted to speak to because, I've seen from psychiatry in Jamaica, they would show charts where they talk about your brain development finishing more at 25, not at 18, which is the idea of an adult.
And I would not advocate it for anybody younger than 25. I don't want my child to have access younger than 25, but it's got to come from other places, somebody that's capable of, and has doesn't have self-destructive tendencies, right? Because isn't that at the core of a lot of these things is self-hatred.
Yeah.
These are internalized.
So the idea is that if there was a legal age, you would want it to be 25 and not 18 or...
Yeah, I think as close to 25 as you can get. The evidence, the science is really supportive of that. Now, obviously, somebody that's 24, 23 is an adult, and they can make their choices. And I think you also need to make a distinction. Like, it's not about the once a week, twice a week, parties on the weekend. That's not. It's the daily use. Yeah. It's because it's rewiring your brain, right, to always be needing this stimulant. So it's the daily use.
The daily use is the issue before age 20.
Which is the same for alcohol.
Which is the same, yeah. Which, I mean, alcohol, the types of crimes, by the way, that they were showing that people commit on different drugs were very different. Nobody is going off with weed and doing a hit and run and driving.
Well, right,
That's not what they're doing.
Yes.
Well, alcohol and cocaine and some MDMA and other drugs, you see more of that.
Yeah.
So it was just that, like, the violent crimes with weed were more interpersonal. Things like, I stabbed the person after in a fight that maybe you wouldn't have done that without the weed.
But we have to also understand, like, there's mental illness as a result of incarceration and criminalization, and there's a consequence to it, and the problem, another additional problem that rural peoples face is that they are faced with the responsibility of taking care of a disproportionate number of mentally ill and disabled peoples. Successful brothers and sisters have gotten jobs in the US and in England and Canada, and the person that wants to stick to farming on the family plot has to take care of those people who are disabled and didn't get through a school system and didn't get, or the elderly, right?
I've never heard it in that way before, and I'm sure I know people who can attest to basically having to support their family members who haven't progressed in society as much. Maybe they have a child early, maybe they are taking drugs, whatever the reason that they're not participating in the wage economy, but they're on a kind of sustenance farm type thing, but they need other things that you have to then take your own salary or your own money to kind of support them. And I'm sure that is a burden that...
And it's also where a lot of the tensions that produce gun violence come from, right? Because most of we have two prominent types of gun violence in Jamaica. One is the garrison gangs circumstances, but then you have internecine, as the Prime Minister calls it, family conflicts. So somebody overseas is working 30 years as a nurse. They're using over the time they're using funds to build a home back home, which their sibling is taking care of, and the siblings may even be doing the labor themselves to build the home with the money that is being sent, and they're living in it while the other person is abroad. But then they come back from abroad, they want the house now, and the other person feels like it's theirs, right? And those are the kinds of battles and inheritance and things like that are contributing an enormous amount of the gun violence in the country.
Well, there's something in your article that spoke about this idea that because of the multi-generational nature of some of these land plots and people leaving and moving, that they weren't able to kind of break it into subdivisions.
Yeah.
And because they didn't break into subdivisions, they're not able to get the title of the land. But there was this work about post-slavery customs of alienation through sale. Like, what do you mean by that?
Oh yes. Yeah. So this is the sociological, anthropological point that there is a custom within Jamaica since the end of slavery. Is that the family home, you can't sell it.
Yeah.
So, and the reason why is because somebody has to pass it on to their children. And because it's the importance of its security, right? Like, it gives you something. If you have no job, you at least have something to work, right? So there's a tendency for parents to not sell, and even if they had title, they don't want their children to then sell it. And so there's all these tensions that build up around the land, and the people who are living on it almost certainly, well, in many cases, a third of the cases don't have a title deed. So they can't go to the bank and get a loan to put in the ganja crop or whatever crop, right? So this is a problem. And this is where I think there's policy mechanisms around with the marketing board that could purchase ganja irrespective of the plots it's grown on. And the marketing board, the first priority of it would be to buy ganja. And I think that's one of the points, that it's far-fetched and it purposefully so. But if the Jamaican government wanted to get rid of illicit ganja production next year, they could do it by buying it.
Yeah.
You simply buy it, and it's not on the illegal market. And and you can test it. If it's not sufficient quality to sell, well, then you burn it, but you can still pay the person for it. And this is where it's like, because that is the reparations transfer to the person who deserves it. And not only that, but you get a phone number, and then you have extension agents who are like, oh, go out and find where he's growing and see if what needs to be done to improve their product, right? So you start from treating them in a positive manner, like not as a carceral issue, right? It's not a law enforcement, but it's about how can we help? And then you get to have an assessment. I say you take in social workers. Like, how many people are they supporting as dependents? What are the social problems? What are the housing problems that they have? And then, start to chip away at those things that are preventing people from growing the kind of ganja that is high quality. And of course, that this is the other dimension of underdevelopment of those peoples, is that the product that they are producing is not as good all the time. I mean, there are cases where I have seen people who get some decent seeds and they grow on almost rock, it's just like barely soil there. And they produce with very little inputs, exceptional quality. They lost 50% of their things because of their plants because of drought, and they didn't have enough water. But the ones that survived are really hardy, and they're very high in THC, and I would say there are cases where I have found stuff that is in some respects better than what the capitalized producers are bringing out. So and that is because there is something about terroir and the geographic indications, the conditions that are particular to Orange Hill in Jamaica, but other places as well. And I think that those kinds of things do need to be paid attention to, and they are ones that can allow you to create a product that can garner a higher price on the global market. And that global market has not dried up. There are people who want it, but Jamaica is losing its regional markets. The guns for drugs issue, and the fact that Jamaican growers and dealers are going out in small boats and going to Haiti and getting giving them drugs and getting guns from them. Well, first of all, I think that it's really important to point out that we know where the sources of those guns are. They're produced in factories in Florida. So if we want to stop the guns for drugs, you got to stop the U.S. from producing them and selling them in the most relaxed terms possible. And there's evidence that proves all of this, and the Jamaican government has made efforts to try and curtail the manufacturers, and they don't get cooperation from the U.S. So there's that dimension to it. But what I am seeing is increasing evidence that shows that Jamaica's historic markets, such as Barbados, such as maybe it's Dominican Republic.
Cayman, maybe.
Cayman. There's a number of islands within the Caribbean where historically those people want Jamaican ganja. Even St. Vincent, right, that produces and has been a historic producer for the lowest quality stuff in Barbados for many years. Those growers, they want the Jamaican stuff.
Yeah.
But what is happening instead is that product from producers in North America, and certainly many in Canada, is ending up in the Caribbean market. The Jamaican small fishing boats are not getting through anymore. They're really not. And this is partly why the people like the Westmoreland ganja growers are living in conditions in which they're in fact worse. The prices aren't as high because there isn't the markets they can get it to. But not only is product from North America making its way into the Caribbean, but there's a lot of evidence suggesting it's actually the licensed producers, and I take their words for it. I use some quotations from executives that talk about this taking place and the ways it happens. But even then, you have illicit producers still in North America that are also managing to get ganja into other Caribbean islands. You just Google, Canadian trafficker Barbados, and see how many Google hits that show up with people getting busted for 500 pounds of cannabis, going into bar. I mean, there's a lot of Canadians now in jails in the region because they're getting caught, but there's a lot that's not getting caught. And I've even talked to fishermen in the Grill area who say they know people who've actually been on board of boats smuggling Canadian produced stuff into other islands.
So I'm guessing Canada somehow gets it to Florida or somewhere like that and then moves it down, or they just...
Yeah, I don't know the routes.
Full route.
There's a lot on the plains, but I mean, now the thing is it's the Barbados, has realized that, and now it takes a long time to go through customs when you get a plane from Canada to Barbados.
That's crazy.
So yeah, but so these are the ways that Jamaica's losing out on a potential lucrative market that could be improving people's salaries here. So I think that is a failure of the legalization process that hasn't been adequately dealt with.
So a couple more things before we end. There's this place called the School of Sacramento University that you went to, or the Rastafarian School of Sacramento University. Can you just tell me a little bit about that, what that is, and what was the 10-day program that you did over there?
Yeah, it was actually a really wonderful experience for me. There's a number of scholars, university lecturers and professors that are Rastafarian, or some are like close allies and have made a career studying Rastafari. But Jelani Naya at the University of the West Indies is one of the local people involved who's quite prominent. But they basically created a 10-day online grad seminar, grad class. It was the highest levels of teaching, and the resources that were utilized and the participation. Most people were students or grad students, but not everybody. There were people who were in the culture industry that were taking part, and they provided readings. It was all done online, and there were people connecting from all over the world, but predominantly U.S., European countries, and people in Jamaica as well. Some other islands. What's that?
Did you enjoy it?
I loved it. I learned so much. I really, it was really the first time in my life that I came to gain a more holistic comprehension of Rastafarianism. I mean, I always had a sort of personal admiration for Rastas, largely because I always met the people that were Rastafarian in African countries. I was doing research, were always so welcoming, and they were also the only people in countries like Zambia, well, not the only, but among the only ones that were keeping the black radical intellectual tradition alive.
Yeah.
They, in a country that was just totally hammered by neoliberal economic policies over many years, you have people at the university that end up embracing the neoliberal economic rationale, and you lost critical scholars, but the Rastafari were always looking at the issues concerning Africans and their underdevelopment in relation to imperialist nations, and so I always admired that. And they're also vegetarian.
Yeah.
and I have been vegan I eat fish, but other than that, I've been vegan since I was like 18 years old. So I always could find food that was wonderful. Yeah, and I really appreciated but now I gained a lot of understanding. So the Rastafarian School of Sacrament University, it's online, and if they do other rounds of the courses, I really encourage people to take part, because it's very rewarding, enlightening, intellectually stimulating, and it gives you you take it, and it doesn't. Some aspects of Rastafari, if you're at a distance, they sound pretty far fetched and like, wow, you guys are a bit out there. But it seems it makes sense when you put it in the context of all the readings and the conversations and about its history. So I admired that.
So to wrap it up, for the neoliberal capitalists that basically run the country now, and everything's about money, must be, and money for themselves, for the business elite, what is the economic value of the ganja plant in its current state in terms of what we're burning up? I think you had something like $2 to $3 billion US, or
yeah. So I used figures that I derived from work that a University of Toronto professor, Kevin Edmonds, has done, and his PhD thesis was based on the St. Lucia and St. Vincent legalization processes, and he used a figure. He got a figure by taking the value, the estimated market value of the cannabis that Jamaican constabulary forces and armed forces have intercepted. Now, they tell him that this represents about 10% of what gets through. And so, he used 2020 data, and he estimated at a base price of $40 a kilogram, or like it's worth way more than that. But even just based on that, he is saying that it's upwards of $3 to $4 billion value that is being produced by smallholders even to this day in Jamaica. And so if that's the case, he's saying it rivals tourism.
I totally see that. And I would argue that, when you look at the economy of Fiji, which 3% of the economy is Fiji water, or 20% of the exports is Fiji water. Wow. The geographical indication of a very powerful brand, Jamaican WEED, I'm sure we could see way more economic value, and as a percentage of our economy, it could be very, very high, especially as you speak about it, moving from this type of very low base price commodity, but moving to a grape type thing where the value that what you do afterwards. So if we could get to the state or the place where,
absolutely,
pre-rolls coming from Jamaica, not rolled by a factory, but hand rolled by Rastafarian, tribes leaders, somebody in Silicon Valley saying, I paid $150 for this and it was blessed by X person and he's smoking it with his friends. I'm sure there will be a market for that, because with anything where the people who consume it have money and basically they're interested in it being more holistic, that means there's a premium price.
So here's something that I encourage Jamaicans to do, is to think about tobacco. Who makes the most expensive tobacco in the world?
It's Cuba, right?
It's Cuba.
Yeah.
And they have a marketing board. It's smallholders who produce it. And it's the best tobacco in the world. But most importantly, they protect it and sell it. Oh, they won't let people sell Cuban tobacco unless it's got the stamp, right? I mean, it's not to say that Cuba's a panacea under, American blockade for decades. It's got a ton of problems, and there's lots of ways it can be criticized. But if you take a small farmer in Jamaica at the lowest level versus a small farmer in Cuba, I would rather be the one in Cuba, because they're going to get healthcare covered. It's going to be good healthcare. They may struggle to get you some of the medications you need, but it will be free, and they have good schooling, and those two things rural peoples in Jamaica don't have. It's very basic. So it's like, so on those bases, yes, I would rather be the poor farmer in Cuba, but the thing is they utilize a marketing board and they don't let it be sold. So all producers at all levels in Jamaica could benefit by ensuring that exports, and I'm imagining an export market is going to be much larger in 10 years. So you've got to build, plan for this, but you have graded supply, and it garners a price based on its grade and what its uses are for. You invest in extraction. Obviously, there's people who have excellent extraction technologies here, but there's ways that this is going to have to be advanced to try and take out micronutrients from the chemical so that you can, give it to children who need it for epilepsy or something, if somebody's treating an autoimmune disease that they don't, so on in a medical sense, for somebody like myself, I might want pain medication, but I need to have my brain. I can't be high while I'm teaching a class, right? So these are the types of applications that we'd be looking for in the future that fills an enormous gap in medications available. So you're going to, in all of that, you can extract more if you band together and make sure that everything that gets a stamp of Jamaican ganja has adhered to standards that are agreed by everybody, that are to be achieved. That they have to have, there's all kinds of ways that standardization needs to take place depending on the type of product. And there's another aspect of it as well, because there is an interest in more like cigar type. You get a really nice aged strains, things like that will be high value. Like somebody's going to have a celebration, instead of having your big nicotine cigar, you're going to have your nice ganja. Fancy aged ganja, which will be lower in THC, but it's for the aesthetic pleasure
and the feeling, and it has a written letter or something and saying this is our best batch and we've aged it.
Yeah. So these are, and that is, I was normally I guess coming into this, I was biased against the idea of pre-rolls, but that's where there's a lot of the only growth really in Canadian markets, from what I'm hearing in investment podcasts and things, is that the pre-rolls are really selling.
Yeah, I would think so, because if you want to open up the market you have to kind of make basically an authentic action less intimidating to people who don't regularly smoke.
Well, yeah, roll a perfect, one that's going to burn
exactly, and they might not know how to roll, and that's creating a barrier.
Yeah,
and I can assume that there might be people who are doing that, because I've smoked cigars, right? But that's exactly what you said, celebration or whatever. If the requirement was, okay, Craig, before you smoke the cigar, all you have to do is just use the cutter and then light it. And if I don't even want to use a cutter, my friend who does is going to use it.
Yeah.
The requirement was, okay, No, you have to have been rolling for a year to do it perfectly. You're gonna have to go buy. I'd be like, guys, I don't know if I'm gonna do that.
Yeah.
But the idea of a pre-roll, unless you said about like the value add of afterwards, I think you can even in that process of rolling it, add value. You can say it was hand rolled.
Yeah.
You can say it was hand rolled by X. It was hand rolled in a specific area. There are many marketing points that me as a consumer, if I was to take it out and say, okay, you know, we're going to share, yeah, I brought this in Jamaica from the village, and the village actually hand rolls all of them in a room and they bless it with the elders. And then someone say, oh, wow. And say, oh, well, mine just hand rolled by a factory, machine. No, that's why this is more expensive. I think those are the things that you can create marketing stories.
But the preservation of the genetic content here has different dimensions to it. But like, I think it's really to leave on a note that cannabis grown outdoors and cannabis that's even what you'd say feral is like growing on its own. Somebody forgot about plants or they left seeds growing. That needs to stay there because it strengthens the genetics of the seeds that you have, stocks that you have available. There's a problem that's coming in the industry is that it's increasingly inbreeding from a selected limited number of strains that mostly became really popular in Europe and North America, and then they just inbreeding, you're making them susceptible to
disease or whatever.
Yes.
That makes sense.
So that grower that's out in the hills and has stuff that's struggling, dealing with the elements is the future strength of your Jamaican strains.
And maybe the whole world.
Yeah. So we need to be thinking about these things, the ecological challenges that will be facing the industry, and you've got to take it seriously because if you can wipe out, you know, if you put so much of your energies into producing a national crop, you have to ensure that it's not susceptible.
Dr. Toby, it was so fantastic having you here. I've personally learned a lot. I hope you guys who are watching it have also learned. We learned history that I didn't know existed, meaning the Maroons being this kind of possibly seafaring people through the intermarrying of through the Tainos who are also moving. The fact that 1 in 10 African slave ships actually had mutiny, and some actually were won, which means that there were then people of African descent, of literal origin, who now had a ship. What does that mean? What does that mean about their mobility? How do they join? And that kind of creates a different history for us in terms of the movement of our people. And then the idea that some of us were not just chosen at random in terms of a slave just being captured, that there was actually a thing of, well, this person has this type of skill, this person has this element that they can bring in, and they were being chosen for certain types of things. And that means a whole different story for the genetic populace of the Jamaican descendants, because it means our forefathers were also brought here not because of their hardness but also their intellectualism, the fact that they maybe were good at engineering, they're good at agriculture, they had a growing hand, and they had already kind of specialized into certain skills. So that was also new for me. But the main thing was basically around the ganja plant, its importance in certain communities that we are now not allowing to participate or benefit properly in the new world of legalization and decriminalization. And that is a major disservice for the people that have basically carried the plant this whole time, culturally, historically, and even just made sure it survived in the areas that they were allowed to kind of grow this without intervention from the police continually and all these negative things. And so I found the conversation very, very, very enlightening, entertaining, and I hope you guys go ahead and share the video so more people can see this content, go out there and talk about it. And if any of these salient points become something that is clear to you, why don't you talk not only to your friends, but ask your MPs, ask your government, ask the private sector to kind of make a change and a commitment to do something about it. So Toby, thank you so much for coming. Really pleasure having you here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
You know, it was excellent.
Well, I hope it's the start of a conversation, because, at least a place, a bookmark in it. It's ongoing, and fortunately, I have to point out that participating in the CanX conference last week, I was really heartened to meet a whole number of really smart Jamaican people in the industry and in academia that are doing really good work on cannabis, and I think that needs to be added to, built upon. It's a good foundation, but yeah, work is to be done.
I mean, just get it out there.
Yeah.
Well, all right, guys. See you later. I'll see you next time on The Code.